An avoidant doesn't relax when they feel safe. They relax when they feel seen. When an avoidant sees you as the one, something subtle but profound changes. They stop performing the carefully constructed version of themselves, the one designed to be impressive, controlled, and emotionally untouchable, begins to dissolve. Not because they've suddenly healed and not because they feel completely safe, but because maintaining that performance around you becomes exhausting. You're no longer someone they need to win over. You're someone who sees through them. And that awareness quietly disarms their defenses. The stories they tell stop sounding rehearsed. They no longer shape their words to land perfectly or present themselves as emotionally unaffected. The charm softens, the polish fades. What replaces it isn't dramatic vulnerability. It's something far more telling, neutrality. They speak with less calculation. They don't rush to fill pauses. They let moments hang unfinished. This is not indifference, it's exposure. Because silence for an avoidant is risky. Silence leaves room for authenticity to leak out. You may notice they stop correcting themselves mid-sentence. They don't backtrack as often. They allow awkward phrasing, half-thoughts, and unfiltered reactions to exist. That's because impression management requires constant monitoring, and monitoring requires emotional distance. When they stop monitoring themselves around you, it means the distance has already collapsed. You're close enough now that pretending no longer feels sustainable. This is where many people get confused. They think the avoidant is losing interest, that the spark is fading, that the effort is gone. But what's actually happening is the opposite. The effort was the mask. And the mask only exists when attachment is still optional. When you become the one, attachment stops being theoretical. It becomes real. And real attachment activates the deepest survival responses in an avoidant nervous system. Performance is protection. It keeps them admired but untouched. It allows connection without exposure. But once they realize that you're not just observing the surface, that you notice patterns, contradictions, silences, they understand something important. The performance no longer works on you, and maintaining it becomes pointless. Worse, it becomes dangerous. Because the more they perform, the more they risk losing you once the mask eventually slips. So they let it slip voluntarily in small ways. They allow themselves to be less impressive, less edited, less strategically likable. This is not comfort. This is surrendering control. And for an avoidant, control is the last line of emotional defense. When they stop performing, they are not offering you the best version of themselves. They are offering you the true one, the unarmored one, the one that doesn't know how to secure love through authenticity, only through distance. And that's why this phase feels quieter, heavier, and more confusing than the beginning. Because when an avoidant stops performing, it means you've crossed a line they never intended to let anyone cross. You're no longer someone they're trying to impress. You're someone who has the power to see them clearly and leave anyway. An avoidant doesn't ask if you love them, they test whether you'll stay when they disappear. When an avoidant starts to see you as the one, their fear doesn't show up as neediness or reassurance seeking. It shows up as testing loss. They don't lean in to confirm love. They lean to measure how dangerous attachment has become. This is the moment where many people misunderstand what's happening and take it personally because the behavior looks like withdrawal, detachment, or sudden emotional coldness. But internally, something very different is unfolding. Avoidants don't ask, "Do you care about me?" They ask what happens if I'm not here. So they create space, sometimes subtly, sometimes abruptly. Replies slow down. Emotional warmth becomes inconsistent. They become harder to reach, less available, less responsive, not because they've stopped feeling, but because the feeling has crossed a threshold. You matter enough now that losing you would hurt. And hurt is the one sensation they've trained themselves to avoid at all costs. This is not a conscious strategy, it's a nervous system reflex. Attachment activates threat. Closeness triggers memory, and memory reminds them that dependence once came with disappointment, intrusion, or loss of autonomy. So instead of asking for reassurance, they simulate absence. They disappear just enough to observe what happens next. They watch carefully. Do you panic? Do you chase? Do you collapse emotionally? Or do you remain grounded? Your response tells them everything. If you chase, it confirms their belief that closeness leads to pressure. If you protest, it reinforces the idea that attachment equals obligation. If you fall apart, it signals that connection comes with responsibility. They can't sustain what they're secretly hoping for, but rarely receive, is steadiness without pursuit, presence without demand. A calm response that says, I notice the distance, but I don't abandon myself to fix it. That response confuses their entire attachment blueprint because it suggests something they've never learned to trust. Connection that doesn't cost freedom. This is why avoidants test loss instead of love. Love feels abstract. Loss feels real. Love can be rationalized away. Loss hits the body, and only when something reaches the body does an avoidant fully register its importance. Ironically, the more they care, the more extreme the test becomes, because the stakes feel higher. Losing you would hurt more than losing anyone before, so they must know before it's too late whether attachment to you will destroy them or stabilize them. This is also why these tests often happen right after emotional closeness. A deep conversation, a moment of connection, a feeling of being understood. The system overloads, and distance becomes the emergency brake. If you're experiencing this phase, understand this. You are not being tested for your love. You are being tested for your self-regulation, for your ability to remain whole without controlling the bond. Because to an avoidant, the safest love isn't the loudest one. It's the one that survives space. Right when it feels like it's finally working, they destabilize it. When an avoidant begins to see you as the one, their behavior often becomes most confusing at the exact moment you expect. Clarity. Things feel aligned, conversations deepen, the connection stabilizes. There's a sense, quiet but unmistakable, that something real is forming. And then almost on cue, their consistency fractures. Not gradually, abruptly. The timing feels cruel, but it's not accidental. It's neurological. Avoidants don't destabilize relationships when they're unsure. They destabilize them when certainty gets too close. This is where people misread the signal. They assume the avoidant has lost interest, met someone else, or realized they don't want commitment. But internally, what's happening is far more unsettling. Emotional closeness has crossed into significance. You're no longer an option. You're a risk. And risk activates every defense they've spent years perfecting. Plans that once felt solid become vague. Messages that were warm become neutral. Affection appears one day and disappears the next. You're not being slowly phased out. You're being held at arm's length while they try to regulate the fear you now represent. Because your importance has created pressure. And pressure to an avoidant nervous system feels like loss of control. Consistency requires emotional presence. Presence requires vulnerability. And vulnerability threatens their autonomy. So the system does what it's always done. It creates instability to regain equilibrium. Distance becomes a way to breathe again. Inconsistency becomes self-soothing. It's not a strategy to confuse you. It's an attempt to calm themselves. Unfortunately, the cost of that regulation is your sense of safety. What makes this phase particularly painful is the contrast. You've seen who they can be when they're connected. You felt the potential, and now you're left questioning whether that version was ever real. It was, but it wasn't sustainable for them yet. The closer you get to being the one, the more their internal conflict intensifies. Part of them wants proximity. Another part is sounding alarms. And instead of choosing one, they oscillate. Hot, cold, present, absent. It's not manipulation, it's fragmentation. They don't know how to hold something precious without fearing its loss. So they create emotional turbulence as a way to avoid settling into a position where losing you would devastate them. If the connection never fully stabilizes, neither does the pain. This is also why their inconsistency often shows up after moments of intimacy, a vulnerable conversation, a shared silence, a feeling of being deeply understood. Those moments linger in their body longer than they know how to manage. And instead of leaning into them, they disrupt them. If you're experiencing this, the truth is difficult but clarifying. You are not failing to inspire commitment. You are triggering attachment, and attachment for an avoidant feels like standing too close to the edge of something irreversible. They aren't pulling away because they don't care. They're pulling away because they do, and they don't yet trust themselves to survive that truth. They don't say forever, they say someday, and watch what it does to you. When an avoidant starts to see you as the one, the future enters the conversation, but never directly. They don't make declarations. They don't draw clear lines. Instead, they circle time cautiously, as if approaching something fragile. You'll hear references that feel almost accidental, a comment about next year, a passing mention of something you might do together, eventually, a subtle inclusion of you in a future scenario that isn't framed as a promise. These moments are easy to miss, but they're intentional. Avoidants don't speak about the future to commit. They speak about it to test their internal response and yours. When they reference the future, they're watching closely, not just your words, but your energy. Do you tense up, get excited, start planning, or do you stay grounded, present, ungrasping? Your reaction tells them whether time with you feels expansive or suffocating. Because for an avoidant, the future isn't romantic. It's a threat to autonomy. They avoid direct commitments because commitment requires certainty, and certainty implies permanence. Permanence implies loss of exits. Even if they want you, even if they care deeply, saying something concrete about the future makes the attachment feel irreversible. And irreversibility is where their fear lives. So instead of promises, they offer probes. Instead of declarations, they float possibilities. Instead of "I want to build a life with you," they say, "It would be nice to do this someday." If they're truly avoidant, they'll often say these things casually, almost dismissively, so they can retreat if the feeling becomes overwhelming. But make no mistake, these moments matter. They are quietly checking whether imagining a future with you destabilizes them or grounds them. If they keep circling the idea of later instead of avoiding it altogether, that's significant. Many avoidants shut the future down completely. When someone doesn't matter, they stay present only, non-committal, detached. But when you are important, time becomes unavoidable. They can't not think about it, so they approach it sideways. This indirectness often leaves the other person feeling uncertain. You sense movement, but no direction. You feel included, but not anchored. That confusion isn't accidental. It's the space they need to explore attachment without fully stepping into it. What they're hoping, often unconsciously, is that you won't rush to define what they're only beginning to feel, that you won't force clarity where they're still negotiating fear. Because when you respond with pressure, the future collapses into threat. But when you respond with presence, the future feels less dangerous. An avoidant talking about the future, even vaguely, is not a sign of readiness. It's a sign of conflict, a sign that you've become important enough to imagine time with while still being frightening enough to approach with caution. They're not avoiding the future because they don't want you in it. They're approaching it slowly because wanting you in it scares them. They don't accuse you, they observe you. When an avoidant begins to see you as the one, jealousy doesn't show up in obvious or dramatic ways. There are no confrontations, no demands, no questions about who you're talking to or where you've been. Instead, their jealousy goes inward. It becomes silent, analytical, and tightly controlled. Because expressing jealousy would require vulnerability, and vulnerability would expose how much you actually matter. Avoidants don't compete for attention. They assess risk. They notice details most people would miss. Who gets your laughter? Who has access to your time? Who feels familiar in your world? They clock changes in your energy, your responsiveness, your availability, but they rarely speak on it. Not because they don't care, because caring feels dangerous. Jealousy for an avoidant isn't about possession. It's about exposure. Admitting jealousy would mean admitting attachment. And attachment threatens the emotional independence they've built their identity around. So instead of reaching toward you, they pull back slightly. They become quieter, more self-contained, less expressive. This is often where people misinterpret this signal. They assume the avoidant is losing interest or becoming emotionally distant for no reason. But internally, the opposite is happening. The realization that you could be chosen by someone else activates fear, not fear of competition, but fear of loss. And loss is something avoidants prepare for long before it happens. They don't try to control your behavior. They don't ask for reassurance. They simply take note. And if the jealousy becomes too intense, they create distance, not to punish you, but to regulate themselves. Because the more attached they feel, the more they need space to contain it. What makes this particularly painful is the restraint. You may never hear them say they're afraid of losing you. You may never hear them admit they care, but you'll feel the shift, the subtle withdrawal, the emotional buffering, the quiet recalibration of the bond. Avoidants believe that wanting something too much gives it power over them. So when jealousy surfaces, they don't express it, they suppress it. They try to neutralize the feeling by emotionally stepping back. Unfortunately, this often creates the very distance they fear. If you're paying close attention, you'll notice that their jealousy shows up not in words, but in timing, in their presence when you pull away, in their attention when they sense yours drifting, in the way they suddenly re-engage after a period of distance. They may never say, "I'm afraid of losing you," but if they're quietly watching instead of walking away, it's because you already matter more than they're willing to admit. When an avoidant opens up, it rarely sounds like opening up. When an avoidant starts to see you as the one, disclosure begins, but not in the way most people expect. There are no emotional confessions, no dramatic admissions of fear or longing. Instead, they share information, facts, background, context, pieces of their history delivered calmly, almost clinically. This isn't avoidance of intimacy. It is intimacy filtered through the only language they trust. Avoidants don't lead with feelings because feelings feel uncontrollable. They lead with data because data feels safe. You may hear about their childhood, but without emotional framing, past relationships, but without regret, family dynamics, but without blame. The stories arrive stripped of tone, as if they're reporting rather than reliving. To someone unfamiliar with avoidant attachment, this can feel cold or detached, but it's actually a sign of proximity. They are letting you inside their internal architecture. This is how avoidants say, "Here is what shaped me," not "here is how it hurt me." They offer the map before the meaning, because meaning requires vulnerability, and vulnerability risks being seen as weak, needy, or dependent. Information allows them to stay regulated while still revealing themselves. It's a controlled opening, a way to be known without losing emotional control. What makes this significant is who they choose to share these details with. Avoidants don't casually disclose personal history. They compartmentalize. They keep their inner world private. If they're explaining patterns, behaviors, or past dynamics to you, it means they trust you not to use that knowledge against them. This kind of sharing is also preventative. They're not just opening up. They're warning you. This is how I am. This is where I shut down. This is what happened before. It's their way of managing expectations without asking for reassurance. Because asking for reassurance would mean admitting they care about your response. You might notice that they become more articulate about their past the closer you get. That's not coincidence. As attachment deepens, they feel the need to contextualize themselves to reduce the risk of misunderstanding or emotional demand later. They'd rather explain themselves now than be emotionally confronted later. The danger here is misreading the signal. Many people push for more emotion, assuming it's the next step, but pressure for emotional expression can feel invasive to an avoidant. They're offering connection on their terms at a pace that keeps them regulated. If you can hear what they're saying beneath the neutrality, you'll recognize it for what it is. Trust. This is the most vulnerable form of opening they know how to offer. Not raw emotion, but access. When an avoidant starts giving you information they've never shared with others, it means you're no longer outside their walls. You're inside them. And for someone who learned early, that closeness comes at a cost. That access is not given lightly. Their deepest fear isn't losing you, it's losing themselves because of you. When an avoidant begins to see you as the one, a new kind of fear emerges, one that has nothing to do with abandonment and everything to do with identity. They start to sense that being with you is changing them, not dramatically, quietly, subtly, in ways that feel irreversible, and that realization is deeply unsettling. Avoidants build their sense of self around self-sufficiency. Independence isn't just a preference, it's protection. Their identity is structured on not needing, not depending, not being emotionally impacted. So when connection with you begins to soften them, it threatens the very framework they rely on to feel safe. they notice themselves becoming more present, more emotionally available, more affected by your mood, your absence, your reactions. And instead of feeling comforted by this closeness, they feel exposed because change implies influence, and influence implies vulnerability. Loving you means allowing yourself to be shaped by someone else, and for an avoidant, that feels like losing control. This is where the internal conflict intensifies. One part of them wants the connection. It feels grounding, calming, real. Another part is alarmed by the shift. They don't recognize themselves in this softened state. They worry that if they keep going, they'll lose the version of themselves that once felt strong, protected, and emotionally contained. So they resist. Not by leaving outright, but by pulling back emotionally. They reassert independence. They create distance to remind themselves they're still in control. This isn't rejection of you. It's an attempt to preserve their identity. You might notice them questioning the relationship during moments of closeness, wondering aloud if they're changing too much or losing focus. These aren't doubts about you, they're fears about themselves, about who they become when they let someone matter. What makes this especially painful is that the change they fear is often growth, healthier attachment, greater emotional range, more connection. But growth feels destabilizing when your nervous system equates safety with emotional isolation. So instead of leaning into transformation, they fight it. They try to return to equilibrium by creating space, by cooling off, by reminding themselves they can still stand alone. If you're experiencing this phase, understand this. Your presence is not threatening because it's harmful. It's threatening because it's effective. You're reaching parts of them that were meant to stay dormant. And that power, even when it's loving, feels dangerous to someone who survived by staying unchanged. They don't fear loving you. They fear becoming someone who can't pretend they don't need connection anymore. They don't pursue loudly. They monitor silently. When an avoidant truly begins to see you as the one, pursuit doesn't look the way it does for others. There's no chasing, no dramatic bids for attention, no emotional urgency. Instead, their awareness sharpens. They become acutely observant, quietly attuned, because while they won't run toward you, they are deeply tracking the bond. Avoidants are hyper-aware of shifts, your tone, your timing, your emotional availability. They notice when replies slow down, when your energy changes, when your presence feels lighter or less invested. But instead of reacting outwardly, they process it internally. Expression would mean revealing attachment, and attachment feels like surrender. So they watch, they don't ask what's wrong, they don't confront, they don't clarify. They gather data, they scan for patterns. They try to understand whether the connection is stabilizing or slipping away without ever admitting how much it matters. This silent monitoring is their version of engagement. It's how they stay connected without risking emotional exposure. What's deceptive about this phase is how detached it can look from the outside. You may feel like you're pulling away and they don't care, but internally the shift registers immediately. Their nervous system responds, even if their behavior doesn't. They feel the loss of proximity before it becomes real. You'll often see this awareness show up indirectly, a perfectly timed message after you emotionally disengage, a sudden increase in presence when you stop reaching, a subtle re-entry when they sense you're no longer waiting. These aren't coincidences, they're responses. Avoidants don't chase because chasing feels like dependence, and dependence feels dangerous. But noticing keeps them informed while preserving autonomy. It allows them to stay attached without feeling trapped. This is why emotional independence is so impactful with avoidance. When you detach not to provoke, but to return to yourself, the shift is felt immediately. They may not say anything, they may not act dramatically, but the internal recalibration begins. They become more attentive, more present in subtle ways, not because they want control, but because the bond feels less secure. And insecurity is the one thing that pierces their emotional armor. If you're looking for proof that you matter, don't look for pursuit. Look for awareness. Look for timing. Look for how they show up right when you stop trying. Avoidants may not run after what they love, but they always notice when it starts to leave. The moment you stop trying is the moment they truly feel you. When an avoidant begins to see you as the one, your emotional independence becomes a mirror reflecting their attachment. They don't notice attachment the way most people do through pursuit or need. They notice it through absence, through space, through the subtle pull of someone stepping back and reclaiming themselves. And when you detach, they feel it in a way that no words or actions could ever replicate. Avoidants don't respond to chasing. They respond to the absence of chasing. When you stop managing the bond, stop seeking clarity, stop guiding the connection, it creates a vacuum. And in that vacuum, they finally register the weight of your presence, the parts of you they took for granted, the constancy they assumed would never end. Detachment acts as a truth serum. It doesn't demand a reaction, but it forces recognition. This is why your withdrawal often triggers more internal movement than any overt confrontation. Silence, neutrality, and self-possession expose the patterns they've avoided. They start to feel the distance in their body, in their thoughts, in their nervous system. Anxiety arises, not because they don't care, but because they do, and because care feels dangerous. The sensation is simultaneously exciting and terrifying. They may not reach out immediately. They may seem unbothered. That's part of the avoidance pattern. Expressing alarm or chasing would be admitting vulnerability. But internally, every observation, every thought, every subtle memory of you intensifies. They start recalculating how they've interacted, what they've risked, and what could happen if you truly... Detachment forces reflection. It exposes truth. It creates contrast between presence and absence in a way that speaking, texting, or managing the bond never could. And the most profound part, you don't need to communicate to affect them. Your independence alone registers more deeply than any argument or confession ever could. This phase is often the most telling. If they've truly begun to see you as the one, detachment activates their awareness. It awakens recognition of value, attachment, and potential loss, and that awakening is quiet, intense, and often invisible to the outside world. It lives in micro adjustments, subtle recalibrations, and a heightened attention to you, even when they act like nothing has changed. Avoidants don't fall apart because someone pulls away aggressively. They fall apart quietly, internally, when someone they've labeled important becomes untouchable. Detachment isn't punishment, it's revelation, and for an avoidant, revelation is the only thing that can awaken true recognition. When an avoidant sees you as the one, they don't run because they don't care. They run because they do. At the culmination of everything, every withdrawal, every subtle test, every quiet observation, the truth of an avoidance attachment is revealed not through words, but through absence and restraint. They won't chase you with drama or urgency. They won't declare love in a way that feels conventional or safe. What they do instead is something quieter, more intense. They measure, they watch, and they regulate their own responses. Because loving you fully threatens the control they've relied on for so long. Avoidants don't show love through pursuit. They show it through presence that is measured, selective, and fleeting. They may return just enough to be noticed, withdraw just enough to test steadiness, speak just enough to maintain connection without revealing how much it matters. This is their version of care, a careful calibration that protects their autonomy while still keeping you inside their internal world. And if you miss it, it can feel like indifference, but make no mistake. It's not absence of feeling, it's a fear-driven strategy to survive attachment without losing themselves. The cruel irony is that the closer you get, the more fear activates. Attachment and intimacy. Things that feel simple in other relationships create internal conflict for an avoidant. They want the connection. And yet, the more they want it, the more it threatens the system that has always kept them safe. That tension drives the pattern of push and pull, arrival and retreat, attention and silence. And the most devastating part? You often don't realize the depth of their attachment until you step back, until you stop trying to prove your worth, until you stop managing the connection, until you become untouchable in your self-possession. Only then does the avoidant feel the true weight of loss and recognition, the understanding that they were attached more deeply than they could admit. Their love is quiet, controlled, and subtle, but it is there, and it is relentless. They may not say it, they may not show it in ways the world recognizes, but internally, their care is constant, measured against every action you take, every absence, every choice to exist fully on your own terms. The final truth is simple yet painful. Avoidants don't leave because they don't care. They leave because caring is terrifying. Their fear isn't a reflection of you. It's a reflection of how deeply they've begun to feel and how poorly they know how to survive that truth. And when they finally recognize what you mean to them, it is often too late to recover, because their love is measured in restraint, not in dramatic displays, and absence is their most honest expression. You'll know you mattered the moment they stop performing, stop chasing, and begin to feel loss without words. And in that quiet, restrained truth, the depth of their attachment becomes undeniable.